This is George Kobakhidze from Baruch College, and this video is going to be on photosynthesis. So first we're going to start off with the net reaction of photosynthesis. And I'll also give you an idea of, how do I know this reactant goes here versus the other side of our equation bar. But first let's write out our reactants. CO2 and water will become glucose, and it's also going to make us oxygen. So we know CO2 goes on the left side for this reason. Plants are cool because they take up CO2. So we know that this goes on the left side. We know H2O is also a reactant because every living thing requires water. So that's this reason. Every living thing requires water. So now on to the right side. We know glucose is a product because this is how the cell is going to nourish itself. So the plant cell needs glucose, needs to make glucose. So we know this is going to be a product. And lastly, we know O2 or oxygen is a product because, again, plants are cool because they provide us humans and other animals with oxygen, because they provide us with oxygen. Okay, the last reactant to include is energy in the form of light. And we call these photons, so call them photons. This is also one of our reactants here. So he will go up here plus those two guys. Okay, and this reaction occurs in the chloroplast. So occurs in the chloroplast. And let me draw one in right here. Okay, so here's the chloroplast. Now, any region kind of inside this liquid-filled region, we call this the stroma. And this is where the light-independent reactions occur, which we'll discuss in a sec. So stroma, we have the light-independent reactions. Okay, inside your chloroplast, you'll have these discs kind of stacked on top of each other. A single disc is called a thylakoid. But a whole stack of these discs, we call this a granum. And the plural of granum, so if you see multiple sets of discs, this is called grana. Okay. So in the membrane of the thylakoid is where we have the light-dependent reactions. Okay, so in the membrane of the thylakoid, we have we'll have a pigment here called chlorophyll, and this is where the light-dependent reactions occur. Light-dependent reactions. Okay, so let me draw my thylakoid membrane. So kind of looks similar to our cell's phospholipid bilayer. But in the membrane, we have this pigment. This guy here is your chlorophyll. Okay, let's say over here is the stroma. And stroma is on the outside of this thylakoid. And on the inside, we can call it a lumen, which is a generic term for the inside of any hollow structure. This is going to be the inside of the cell. Okay. So this is our chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, the structure right here. The photon that we discussed, I'll indicate it with this arrow sign, with this lightning symbol. So let's say this is my photon. It's going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll. There you go. So here's my photon. And it's going to be absorbed by the chlorophyll. Okay. So now let's go on to the light-dependent reactions first. And in the first set, it's going to take the building blocks of ATP, which is ADP. This is a ribose sugar with bonded to a nitrogenous base known as adenine. That's what the A stands for. Don't have to worry about the structure for now, but it's bonded there. And the di stands for 2. We have 2 phosphate groups. So this is your adenine diphosphate. To make ATP in this reaction, we need that third building block. So this tells me that it's going to bond to an inorganic phosphate, just a free-floating phosphate group. And this requires input of energy to stick those two together. This comes from that photon from before. Okay, so our product is going to look like this. Same ribose sugar, same adenine nitrogenous base, and a ribose plus a sugar, we call this adenosine. And now we have our triple phosphates. Triple phosphates. And this here is a high energy compound. High energy because these phosphate groups can carry negative charge, and negative charges repel each other. So this repulsion can lead to instability. So let's write that the negative charges repel each other. And this causes instability. This is kind of synonymous with has high energy. If it's unstable, it's going to react quickly, or you can say has a lot of energy. Has a lot of energy. Okay, so the first reaction is going to create ATP, which we'll use later. The second light-dependent reaction is going to take this compound known as nicotinamide adenosine dinucleotide phosphate. So this was a mouthful, but you don't need to know what it stands for exactly. Don't worry about that. So we have our NADP. We're going to use a water molecule, and we're also going to need that energy from before. Again, these are light-dependent reactions, and here is that energy from the photon, just like before. Okay, so this H2O, you're like, where did this come from? This, if you remember, this is one of our reactants. This is one of our reactants. Okay, in this case, the water is going to serve, well, the fate of this water, it's going to become the oxygen. So hopefully you can gather that from this oxygen right here. And it's also going to serve as a source of protons and electrons for this NAD+. So it's also going to be a source of protons and electrons for this NAD+ right here. So when this reaction takes place, we are going to be left with this compound known as NADPH. Plus we have our oxygen. And remember here, this is one of our products from the general equation above. There's one of our products. Now NADPH is also a high energy compound, but we'll use it in the next series of reactions. Okay, now on to the light independent. So you won't see a photon as a reactant here. Light independent. Light independent reaction. Did I spell this right? Okay, so again, these occur in the stroma, and no light is required here. Okay, so from before, we have ATP made, we have NADPH made, and then we still have one of our starting materials that we haven't talked about yet, and that was CO2. And we know the goal of photosynthesis was to make glucose, right? So how do we go from there to there? So let's see what we have. This ATP is going to be the source of energy to fuel these reactions. Source of energy, to fuel reactions. Now this NADPH, this is known as a reducing agent, which means it's going to, give electrons to this carbon, to the CO2 molecule right here. And NADPH, we can call this an electron carrier, and hopefully you can see why that is. We call this an electron carrier because it carries the electrons to give to the CO2. And the fate of this CO2 is to eventually become a carbohydrate. Okay, so when these reactions take place, we are first going to form something called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So glyceraldehyde 3 and then phosphate. Okay, let's take a look at this. If you remember, glycerol has a 3-carbon backbone. This has the same prefix, glycer. It also has a 3-carbon backbone. So carbon, carbon, carbon. On the 3rd carbon, we have a phosphate group. Let's just put that right here. So here is my phosphate group. And the aldehyde, the second part of the name, means that this terminal carbon here is an aldehyde group. So double bonded to an O and a single bond to an H. Everything else, we know carbon needs 4 bonds. So let's fill the rest with bonds. So this is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. This is a 3-carbon. We call this a simple carbohydrate. Simple carbohydrate. But this isn't glucose just yet. So with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, it's going to go through a series of steps catalyzed by enzymes, and then we're going to make glucose. So we went from a 3-carbon simple carb to the 6-carbon glucose. And then after another series of steps, we're going to attach these glucoses together, and we are going to make starch, which is glucose units covalently bonded. And then I'll put ... because there's many of them. And this here would be starch. And I'll see you in the next video.